epistemic autocracy.
Epistemic,
Yeah,
okay.
Epistemic is derived from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. And, of course, an autocracy is a rule of one, or the rule of, one arbitrary ruler. And in the instance of the 20th century, we have been ruled by one particular variety of epistemology, what's known as empiricism, which is basically sense certainty. You only believe that which you see, and science is pretty much governed under the doctrine of sense certainty. This doctrine, endorsed as a legitimate, objective scientific observation, it amounts to an occult doctrine that's been recycled from 6,000 years ago. And if you look at it, if you examine it philosophically, for instance, empirical observation by itself cannot produce any absolute conclusions. This was determined by a radical empiricist, David Hume. David Hume showed that while you can prove what's known as temporal succession, or one event happening after another, and you can show that juxtaposition of events, and you can also show what's known as spatial proximity, or two events or phenomena in the immediate proximity of each other. You can show these things, but you cannot prove that there's any causal connection between the two. So really, all the results of scientific research, according to this criteria, would rest upon faith. And that is more of a mystical institution than it is a secular one. So really this epistemic autocracy, as my brother and I call it, is really premised upon cult beliefs and mysticism every bit as much as the old theocratic orders that preceded it. But epistemic autocracy basically began with the British Royal Society. This organization was formed under a royal warrant from Charles II in 1662. Ostensibly, the organization was devoted to scientific research and the broadening of human knowledge. However, a darker agenda takes shape when one examines the esoteric heritage of the group's members. Virtually all of the founding members were Freemasons. And Freemasonry is a secret society that adheres to an ancient occult tradition dating back roughly 6,000 years. And that tradition is the religion of the ancient mystery cults. The mystery religion originated in Mesopotamia, particularly in Babylon and Egypt, and it was introduced to the East by the Aryans of Persia and provided the foundation of all the Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. And it also provided theological foundations for Judaic and Christian heresy, religions that would basically distort and pervert Judaism and Christianity, specifically Kabbalism and Gnosticism. But the religion's mythology, in a nutshell, the mystery religion's mythology is as follows. It basically holds that in the beginning, all human consciousness was encapsulated within a singularity, and this singularity has been assigned numerous appellations. The Freemasons, for instance, the book The Meaning of Masonry, which is by Masonic scholar W.M. Wilmshurst, he calls it the group soul or collective soul. H.G. Wells, who has been alleged to have been a Freemason and, of course, was also a Fabian socialist, a member of the Coefficients Club, and closely associated with members of the British Round Table organizations, which would form the Royal Institute of International Affairs and eventually form a stateside branch here in the United States known as the Council on Foreign Relations. H.G. Wells called this singularity the mind of the race, or the racial mind. But at any rate, this singularity constituted, according to the myth, God. And at some indeterminate point of time, the myth alleges that this singularity divided into a plurality. You'll notice that this myth kind of mirrors, or attempts to mirror, an account of the fall of humanity in Eden. However, there are some very, very different elements. It kind of distorts the original Eden account of humanity's fall, because essentially it's not sin that results in the fall of man. It's a diaspora of consciousness into several individual entities. In other words, it's when you and I become individuated from the group soul, from the collective soul. But at any rate, the myth portrays man as a god in the process of becoming. And at the point of apotheosis, or the point at which man becomes God, individuality is obliterated and the collective is acknowledged as supreme reality. This new man is spelled with a capital M, man with a capital M, to connote humanity's purported divinity, has been presented by numerous ideologues throughout history. Hitler called him the Aryan. Nietzsche, who was the philosophical progenitor of Hitler, called him the Übermensch. In communist Russia, he was called the Soviet man. Despite the cultural variations and modifications, the myth remains universal. In the meaning of Masonry, we learn what the chief facilitator for humanity's apotheosis, purported ascent to becoming God, is. I'll read you an excerpt. This is what Wilmhurst, W.M. Wilmhurst, a Masonic scholar, says. Quote, "This, the evolution of man into Superman, was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries, and the real purpose of modern Masonry is not the social and charitable purposes to which so much attention is paid, but the expediting of spiritual evolution of those who aspire to perfect their own nature and transform it into a more godlike quality," unquote. Essentially, that's what the Masons that formed the British Royal Society were, that this was the doctrine that they promoted and promulgated. They promulgated it under numerous appellations and numerous forms. But if you notice, he uses the term there, evolution. This occult process of becoming is evolutionary in character. And that is interesting because long before Charles Darwin even wrote on the origin of the species, evolutionary theory was the intellectual property of the Masonic Lodge. Evolution actually finds its spiritual correlative in the Hindu doctrine of reincarnation, which was imported to England by the British East India Company, and subsequently it was adopted by the Royal Society, which was composed of all Freemasons.
All right, so that was a segment from a podcast that somebody sent me a link to recently by Philip Collins, and he's talking about epistemic autocracy, which essentially is just another way of talking about scientism or scientific dictatorship or technocracy or lots of different terms that essentially in a lot of ways are talking about the same thing. And yeah, he sent it to me saying, I think you'll appreciate this, and sure enough, I was only a few minutes in, and I was pretty excited about everything that he was piecing together. And this was a section from the Bite Show, which was this podcast. I think her name was Georgianne who was doing it. And back in the day, I used to listen to a lot of podcasts. I did listen to the Bite Show once in a while. She had a lot of different guests. And the audio quality of that one isn't so great, but I wanted to include that little clip because he kind of just does a nice summary there at the beginning. But I did find another podcast that he was on called The Iron Show. I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Iron Show with Johnny Iron was his name, I think. And he was doing it up until 2016, it looks like. I don't know what happened, but so I found this other one of The Iron Show, and if you want to listen to more, here's more of a full-length presentation. I'll just play it, without visuals or whatever. So basically just like a podcast. But yeah, epistemic autocracy, technocracy, scientific dictatorship, scientism, tracing it back to mysticism and the occult and all the same things, and the same usual suspects and the same pantheistic monism that is at the core of the mystery religions, as he even refers to in there. And so I think if you are really into all the topics that I've been covering over the past few years, this is really a cool resource, this guy. So I'm going to be probably looking more into other material that he's done. Seems like he's kind of not been so active recently. He's written several books with him and his brother, I think Paul. So Paul and Philip Collins. But yeah, I was pretty excited to come across this. I mean, it's kind of heady in some ways, but at the same time, yeah, is kind of a gold mine in terms of really getting to the root of scientism as a philosophy and as a worldview and as it applies to socio-political contexts, as it applies to religious contexts, just all across the board. So definitely worth taking a listen to if you're so inclined. And of course, I'll leave links in the description. So here we go.
People who lay claim to the right to rule by virtue of their specialized knowledge, their scientific knowledge, their technical knowledge. And of course, in such a societal model, democracy is democracy for a broader constituency ceases to exist. It becomes more of a consolidated democracy. It's a democracy of experts, as H.G. Wells put it in the Open Conspiracy. Basically, it's only the experts take part in the democratic processes, and meanwhile, those who do not exhibit the specialized knowledge, those who aren't part of this coterie of policy professionals, are completely and totally divorced from the democratic system. The concept of a technocracy really finds its proximate origins with Sir Francis Bacon. He was a member of a secret society. He was basically a member of a secret society called the Order of the Helmet, and which is closely aligned with Rosicrucianism. I'll give you some background.
Was that a precursor to Rosicrucianism?
Yeah. For all practical purposes, the organization, the Order of the Helmet, its name was derived from Pallas Athene, which was the Greek goddess of wisdom, who was portrayed wearing a helmet. And although Bacon was regarded as this innovator of science by orthodox academia, his studies mostly embraced occultism, and in his youth he was a student of Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonist philosophy, and he had also studied the Kabbalah. But
could we stop right there and have you explain for our listeners what Gnosticism is, and kind of talk about the things that Francis Bacon actually believed?
Sure. Well, Gnosticism, the term is derived from the Greek term gnostikos, which means knowing. And it's the Gnostics were an ancient Christian heresy which posited gnosis or gnostikos in contradistinction to what in the original Greek was known as pistis, or faith. And basically, the Gnostics held that the pneuma of man, the pneumatikos, that is the spirit of man.
It's like evolution to this day, sort of, isn't it? It's very similar to that.
Yeah, it's very similar. The pneuma of man was separated from the divine pneuma by the physical cosmos, his placement here within the physical cosmos, and man was basically thrust into this prison of sorts by an evil, unjust, tyrannical God, which, for all practical purposes, according to their inverted hermeneutic, was Jehovah. And Jehovah, in turn, was really created by Sophia, which was in the ancient Greek meant wisdom. And here you have this veneration for knowledge, for the cognitive powers of man. And basically, they believed that through gnosis, through the cognitive powers of man, basically humanity could attain its own salvation. And here we have what could be called an anthropocentric soteriology. And the term soteriology, I'll dismantle that for the audience. It comes from the word soter. Jesus declared himself the soter, the Savior. And so soteriology deals with the study of salvation, and with an anthropocentric soteriology, anthro meaning man, centric meaning centered, so man-centered salvation. With an anthropocentric soteriology, man becomes the source of his own salvation. You see this sort of belief espoused by Protagoras, who basically held that man was the measure of all things. But Gnosticism kind of assumed a plethora of forms after the Enlightenment. It was during the Enlightenment, which of course was virulently anti-Christian, that we saw the codification of Gnosticism as a revolutionary doctrine. And it was through this codification of Gnosticism that we saw the emergence of several forms of secular Gnosticism, two of the most prevalent being communism and fascism. But you had the emergence of socio-political utopian movements such as those, who again had this anthropocentric soteriology, where man became the measure of all things. He attained his own salvation through his own cognitive powers. And interestingly enough, with communism and fascism, you find within those two systems of governance, within those political theories, you find strands of technocratic thought, which again, hails from Sir Francis Bacon. And allegedly Bacon, and this is returning to your statement regarding the Rosicrucians, allegedly Bacon was the Grand Master of the secret Rosicrucian order, and the Rosicrucians were closely aligned with Freemasonry. In fact, a Rosicrucian poem that was written in 1638 basically read, quote, "For what we presage is not in gross, for we brethren of the rosy cross, we have the Mason's word, and second sight, things to come we can foretell aright," unquote. In other words, the Rosicrucians believed that they knew the inner secrets of Freemasonry and also possessed psychic powers which they could predict the future with. But it was in 1627 that Bacon published a novel entitled The New Atlantis. And interestingly enough, within the pages of this book, we find symbols such as the two pillars of Solomon's Temple and the blazing triangle, the eye of God, the compass and the square, all of which indicate that Bacon had some association with secret societies that basically proffered some equivalent of his utopian concepts. And that novel, The New Atlantis, described the creation of an invisible college, which was the very same sort of institution that was advocated in Rosicrucian writings. But one of the things that that people should understand is when these esoteric secret societies and the socio-political utopian movements that were basically spawned from them, when they cite biblical iconography, when they cite certain pieces of scripture, they're basically ripping those icons and they're ripping those pieces of scripture from the matrix of a broader biblical gestalt, and they're superimposing upon them their own esoteric interpretations. They're basically reconceptualizing biblical iconography and scriptures within a distinctly occult context. And so for the Freemasons and for the Rosicrucians, these signs and these symbols meant something entirely different than what they would mean for, say, for Christians. Atheism is a philosophical impossibility because in order to conclude with all certainty that there is absolutely no God, one has to lay claim to infinite knowledge. And infinite knowledge, of course, is constitutive of omniscience. Omniscience is a trait that is inherent to deity. And so in order to say there is no God, one has to lay claim to a trait of divinity, thereby becoming God. And you see this with you see this sort of radical divinization, if you will, this apotheosis of man with socialist theoreticians such as Marx and Feuerbach, who basically interpreted God as the projection of all the very best features of humanity into this hypostatic beyond. They believed that all that God was the inherent goodness of man mythologized by man and given a name, the name being God.
So basically it's the proto-evangel all over again anyway.
Right. And according to Marx and Feuerbach, they had this humanist eschatology. They believed that history would reach its apex when man would realize his own alleged intrinsic divinity and draw this projection of God back into himself and be transfigured into Superman or apotheosis. That means to become a god and everything. So and again, this is older. These are older ideas that actually come out of occult theology. Those sort of ideas were promoted by the Rosicrucians, by the Freemasons. And of course they were supposed to be promulgated through what was known as the Invisible College, which was precisely what Francis Bacon was speaking about in his novel The New Atlantis. He talked about the creation of the Invisible College, and the creation of an Invisible College was realized with the formation of the British Royal Society in 1660. And it's interesting because you look at the British Royal Society, and what the British Royal Society basically amounted to was what Paul and I call an epistemological cartel. Now that's a mouthful. I'll dismantle that for the audience. Basically, epistemology is one of the two core pursuits of theoretical philosophy. It's the study of knowledge and what's constitutive of knowledge. The term's derived from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. And there is and interestingly enough, there's an epistemological dimension to science, as is evidenced by the etymology of the field itself. The word science is derived from the Latin word scientia, which also means knowing or knowledge. Yeah. And in many ways, epistemology, it works a lot like an economic system. If you have all the right theoreticians in all the right places, then you can arbitrarily bestow epistemological primacy, complete and total epistemological dominance upon those ideas that are most socially and politically expedient to you. And in such a climate of epistemological suppression, institutional and academic barriers prevent competitors from accessing the marketplace of ideas. So you basically have developed a monopoly over epistemology, and you basically a self-proclaimed cognitive elite monopolizes the economy of popular thought, and hence we have an epistemological cartel, which is essentially a monopoly over knowledge. Cartel epistemologists not only manage the dissemination of knowledge, but also arbitrarily determine what qualifies as knowledge and what qualifies as mere opinion. And of course, epistemological contentions ultimately shape the second core pursuit of theoretical philosophy, which is metaphysics. And metaphysics is concerned with the ultimate character of reality. The questions asked by the epistemologist determine what items will be admissible in discourses concerning metaphysics, and thus epistemology shapes one's views concerning reality itself. So you look at the British Royal Society, which was, for all practical purposes, an epistemological cartel, a tangible enactment of the Invisible College as it was promoted by the Rosicrucians and as it was depicted by Francis Bacon in The New Atlantis. What were the metaphysical contentions that the British Royal Society, what were the metaphysical contentions that it was trying to legitimize through its monopoly over knowledge? Well, let's take a look at what was promoted by the British Royal Society. One of the British Royal Society's primary chief theoreticians and luminaries was none other than T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. And basically, T.H. Huxley...
Wait, could you say that name again? It dropped out.
Sure. T.H. Huxley. T.H. Huxley was, of course, Darwin's bulldog, or Thomas Huxley, and of course the grandfather of Julian Huxley and Aldous Huxley. And T.H. Huxley played a major role in basically prompting Darwin, who was a recluse, to publish The Origin of the Species. And, of course, what did The Origin of the Species do? Well, The Origin of the Species presented this theory of progressive biological development or evolution, which...
Yeah, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
Didn't Darwin... Actually, it wasn't Darwin that really made it popular. It was actually a Darwin, but it wasn't Charles. It was his grandfather wrote a book. I can't think of the name of it.
Zoonomia. You're thinking of, interesting little story behind him. That's Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin actually, and if you look at these theories of evolution, they preceded Darwin. Basically, evolution was the evolutionary theory was another permutation of what's known as transformism. And transformism held that humanity was inherently mutable, that is, that he changed. And transformism held, not only did it hold just far-reaching ramifications in terms of human biology, but it held far-reaching ramifications in terms of society, because the ideas of transformism circulated heavily during the Enlightenment, which was the precursor to the French Revolution. According to transformism, man's biological changes also translated over into political and social changes, and so you had a biological evolution taking place, and at the same time a corresponding political evolution. It's kind of based on the Kabbalistic legend of the Golem, which, the Kabbalistic legend of the Golem presented an artificially created man, a synthetically created man, and according to that Kabbalistic legend, living and dead matter were basically inseparable and everything, and all life sprung from matter, and so matter became a god unto itself. And you see this sort of occult strand of thought running throughout the thesis of abiogenesis, life springing from non-life, which of course Louis Pasteur proved was scientifically impossible. No spontaneous generation can take place. Dead matter cannot produce living matter. But what that did in terms of metaphysics, which again deals with the ultimate nature of reality itself, is it ontologically divorced man from God. God no longer played any sort of role in the creation of man. If at best you have a deistic God, a deistic spirit, an absentee landlord who simply set the process of evolution into motion, and just simply allowed man to emerge from the slime and begin his climb ever upward, onward, moving towards his, working towards his own salvation. And there we have, again, the anthropocentric soteriology of Gnosticism.
Or theistic evolution.
Yeah, and that's why I believe it's Dr. Wolfgang Smith. He refers to Darwinism as he refers to it as a Gnostic myth, because it pays credence to the Gnostic doctrine of self-salvation with the metaphysical claim of self-creation, abiogenesis, spontaneous generation. And that's the only way that the anthropocentric soteriology of Gnosticism will attain any sort of semblance of sense, is if you have the notion of man creating himself, and therefore he's responsible for his own salvation. He attains it through his own cognitive powers, and he gradually, through gnosis, works towards apotheosis, towards becoming a god and everything. Now, the traditional theistic concepts such as salvation and immortality are reconceptualized in a purely immanent sense, and I'll I'll dismantle that term for the audience.
Emanatism.
Yeah, exactly. It's derived from the term immanence, which is from the Latin phrase immanere, which means to remain within. Objects of immanent experience reside purely within the experiential limits of man, within the ontological confines of the physical universe, because as immanent objects, you don't require faith to apprehend their existence and everything. And here again, you have the Gnostic derision for pistis or faith and everything, and the veneration for gnostikos, for knowing, for direct knowing. And so you have so this is basically the sort of metaphysics that the Royal Society were endeavoring to, through their epistemological cartel. The Royal Society was basically endeavoring to legitimize. And you might think, well, that sounds a wee bit conspiratorial and everything. Well, before I fly off into some sort of paranoid left field, let me make it clear. One might argue that the Royal Society was little more than a collection of naive Baconians who basically believed in an oversimplified epistemology of empirical science, which was devoid of intention, devoid of hypotheses, as Newton put it, hypotheses non fingo. However, there was an inner circle within the Royal Society, which the writers James Moore and Adrian Desmond characterized as, quote, a sort of Masonic Darwinian lodge invisible to outsiders, unquote. Science and religion were never, at first, were not separate repositories of knowledge.
No, not in the beginning. They always went hand in hand.
Right. They simply there were just simply different forms of epistemology that worked in correspondence with one another. If you look at the very first sermon delivered by Peter in the book of Acts, he offers proofs. He offers evidentiary claims, evidence-based claims for the faith. He cites the empty tomb of Jesus Christ. He cites the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. He cites miracles. So it's not blind faith, which would essentially be superstition. It's an evidentiary-based faith. The problem is, and then science affirms that through quantification and through empirically discerned studies. The problem is that there was a bifurcation between those two epistemologies, bifurcation or a division.
Didn't that really come from the alchemists? Didn't they start those ideas?
Well, it really began with the nominalist, foremost of which being Occam. The nominalist basically promoted this bifurcation in epistemology between what is revealed, revelation, what is believed, and then what is quantifiably demonstrable, what is measurable, what can be measured. And as a result, you had this division between revelation and empirically and quantifiably demonstrable phenomena, and because revelation was completely and totally separate from that, and revelation was confined to the realm of the spirit, revelation was given by God. The objective character of God was rendered completely and totally unknowable, and thus completely and totally subjective. And you had with this bifurcation in epistemology, this slippery slope to this belief that anything that is quantifiably and empirically demonstrable is constitutive of truth. And that's that for all practical purposes is scientism. Scientism basically is a preoccupation with quantifiable entities. If it cannot be quantified, if it cannot be empirically discerned, then on the grounds of metaphysics, it simply does not exist. And basically, scientism it called for the universal imposition of science on all fields of inquiry, including morality, governance. And the problem with that is that many a modern mind being chronocentric as it is, seeing all the modern wonders of science might consider that sort of imposition desirable. But the problem is that what entities fall outside the realm of quantification? What sort of entities cannot be empirically or quantifiably demonstrated? Well, dignity, liberty, freedom, the spirit of man. Because those entities cannot be quantified, they're simply jettisoned. And herein you have the beginnings of what could be considered the scientific dictatorship, where science is universally imposed on the whole of the social body, and as a result, those concepts of liberty, of democracy, of dignity are all jettisoned because they simply do not fit. They simply do not fit the measuring stick. But returning to the British Royal Society and to examine how it operated as an epistemological cartel, and to examine the conspiratorial aspects of the organization. Again, not every fellow of the British Royal Society was, a member of some high cabal. Many of them were probably naive Baconians. But again, according to James Moore and Adrian Desmond, there was this Masonic Darwinian lodge that was invisible to insiders within the Royal Society, and that inner circle was the X Club. And its members wielded a substantial amount of influence over every famous scientist at the time. All of its members, except Herbert Spencer, were secretaries or presidents of learned societies. And it was none other than T.H. Huxley who presided over the X Club, which manipulated the scientific press. One of the most prevalent examples of the X Club's media manipulation was its obfuscation of the Bathybius-Haeckelii scandal. It was discovered that Bathybius-Haeckelii, which many an evolutionist at the time were contending was the missing Monera, the primordial organic material from which all life sprung. It was discovered that was nothing more than gypsum, a lifeless rock, and not the missing Monera in Ernest Haeckel's phylogenetic tree. And once that was discovered, the X Club suppressed almost every revelation of the debacle. And remember, the X Club was presided over by T.H. Huxley, who was a Freemason and a participant in the formation of the Rhodes Roundtable groups. Now, the Roundtable groups were devoted to the formation of a British-ruled form of global governance. And out of the Roundtable groups would come the Royal Institute for the International Affairs, or the RIIA, and the RIIA would establish a stateside branch here in the United States known as the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR. And this organization has acted as America's premier foreign policy cartel and a major catalyst for globalization. And globalism, in the words of the late Malachi Martin, globalization, according to Malachi Martin, qualified as, quote, socio-political Darwinism, unquote, because it's premised upon the belief that global governance is the natural corollary of man's alleged political evolution. And, of course, the Bathybius-Haeckelii scandal imperiled the veracity of Darwin's claims, which in turn provided the scientific foundation for the global society that Huxley and his Masonic colleagues hoped to see enshrined. But at any rate, the Royal Society exemplifies the concept of an epistemological cartel. Society members like Huxley managed the dissemination of knowledge, which in turn shaped the metaphysical suppositions of others, and such metaphysical suppositions underpin the anthropocentric soteriology of sociopolitical utopians, secular Gnostics, the new Gnostics, who adhered to a secular mythology. And in the beginning of that secular mythology, Eden was a singularity, which was eventually divided into countless pluralities by the Big Bang. And according to the myth, the reconstitution, the regaining of Eden, paradise regained, was achieved through evolution, which invariably requires the assistance of man through several different biological methodologies, namely population control, eugenics, social methodologies such as fascism, communism, or other forms of socio-political utopianism. And as evolution is guided down the desired course, man returns to the singularity, returns to Eden. Eden is reborn, but Eden is completely and totally confined to this ontological plane of existence. Immortality is attainable only through the continuity of the species. Salvation is reconceptualized as survival, and the Eden is completely and totally reconceptualized as a global government and a unified world consciousness.
It's nothing has changed, really.
Right.
Nothing has changed. It's Augustine says this is the city of man. This is the full. It's even if they believe in God or not. You know, they came. It's like he says that here we have the heart of the earthly city. It is God or gods. Is he or they who will help the city to victory, after victory, and to a reign of earthly peace.
Exactly.
And this city worships not because it has a love for service, but its passion is for domination. Remember, you said that on the PID radio.
Right, exactly. You're right on target. Yeah, you're right on target.
Wow, see, that's just cool because that's why I started getting into Augustine really heavily. And I was praying that I would understand, of course, Irenaeus is who I'm going after next because I'm going to his favorite. That's why Augustine, I love him. Have you read City of God?
I had to read it a while back for what it was one of my philosophy courses. And
really? How did you like it? Did you? I mean, it's really deep, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually, what you've been pointing out about Augustine was pointed out to Paul and I by an old friend of ours. He's deceased now. He passed away in 2007. A good friend by the name of Michael Corbin. He used to host.
I'm familiar with him too.
Yeah, he was a great friend. One of the best radio show hosts that we ever associated with. But he pointed out the exact same things that you point out about the city of man and the concept of the city of man. And really, if you look at socio-political utopianism, which for all practical purposes is just a form of secular Gnosticism with a manetist eschatology. Throughout the ages, socio-political utopians have reiterated this concept of a global society, of a city of man, so to speak, under numerous appellations. It's been disseminated under various different names. For instance, you had H.G. Wells, who, interestingly enough, was closely aligned with T.H. Huxley.
He wrote the New World Order, right? That book, New World Order?
He referred to it as the New Republic. He also referred to it as the New World Order.
Yeah,
which was
book. I'm very familiar. He was a prophet of doom.
Yeah.
He was an evolutionist, though, definitely.
Oh yeah.
Is he the one that wrote Brave New World?
Oh no. That was Aldous Huxley, who, interestingly enough, some say was H.G. Wells' protege. But Brave New World is basically a fictionalized account on what sort of society these sort of people have endeavored to create, which Aldous Huxley refers to in his book Brave New World Revisited as a scientific dictatorship. And again, that that term is interchangeable with technocracy, because for all practical purposes, a technocratic form of governance is where we see the imposition of science upon all questions of governance, on questions of political science, and as a result, what is jettisoned? Liberty, democracy are not quantifiably or empirically demonstrable. But let's now. Of course, we started looking at the origins of the concept of a technocratic form of governance, of a technocracy, with Sir Francis Bacon. Tracing its development along a little further, we come to an individual known as Henri de Saint-Simon. Henri de Saint-Simon, whose theories were considered by Frank Fisher, who wrote the book Technocracy, The Politics of Expertise, as the prescription for Bacon's work. Saint-Simon was a radical empiricist. And again, radical empiricism is the epistemological position that all knowledge is derived from the senses. And contemporary science, which one could argue functions as a cosmological myth, is premised upon radical empiricism. And while radical empiricism is commonly presented as the rational alternative to the supposed superstition of mystical faith, it's no less mystical in character. This is demonstrable in radical empiricism's rejection of causality, because what's perceived as A causing B, you throw the ball bounces off the wall, could merely be, according to radical empiricism, a consequence of circumstantial juxtaposition, while we have what's known as temporal succession, that is, two phenomena following each other, and spatial proximity, which we have two objects within the same area. While those are self-evident, those are axiomatic, causal connection, according to radical empiricism, is not axiomatic. An affirmation of causal relationships is impossible, and in the absence of causality, all of a scientist's findings must be taken upon faith. And ironically, science relies on the affirmation of cause and effect relationships. And it was none other than an Enlightenment rationalist, David Hume, that demonstrated this rejection of causality with radical empiricism. But at any rate, St. Simon extended radical empiricism, extended that epistemology into the emergent field of social relations. During the Reign of Terror, St. Simon was imprisoned for 11 months and was constantly in fear for his life. And this experience instilled a deep fear of revolution in St. Simon. And to mitigate the violent climaxes that often accompanied revolutions, St. Simon endeavored to develop a science of human relations, and working under the epistemological assumptions of radical empiricism, St. Simon contended that the diagnosis and healing of societal ills laid in the apprehension of the alleged physiological realities that underpinned all thinking and feeling. For all practical purposes, thinking and feeling, he believed, had biochemical origins. There was no pneuma, there was no pneumatikos, no spirit. They were purely biological, purely physiological in origin. And he extended that principle to the overall social body, to society itself. And this physiological interpretation of society presaged the enshrinement of physiology in the halls of modern social science. And a logical outgrowth of this physiological interpretation was a myriad of institutionalized aberrations, such as lobotomies, pharmacological manipulation, electroshock treatment. All that comes from the extension of radical empiricism to the whole of the social body. But at any rate, in St. Simon's essay on the science of man in 1813, St. Simon contended that physiology had moved beyond a conjectural phase into a positive phase, and was thus poised for speculative extrapolation into the field of governance, into government relations itself. And he believed that the scientific method should be applied to both the individual body and the body politic. And following that belief to its logical conclusion, St. Simon analyzed society according to its physiological components, which were classes. Now, does that sound familiar? This sort of functional class analysis was the stuff that Marxism was made of.
What role did Madame Blavatsky play in all of this?
Well, she had there was an evolutionary framework to her belief system. She believed that man was following this upward trajectory of development, and that he had come from 7 root races. Of course, the dominant race, the absolute pinnacle of that developmental framework being the Aryan, which of course sounds.
One of my big questions to you, Phil, was going to be: do we have a precedent in the past, an example of a technocratic society that had already been formed? Is there a past technocratic society, like, say the Nazi regime?
Okay, there were strands of technocratic thinking throughout Nazism. Now, the important thing to understand is that we've never seen a pure technocracy. We've never seen a pure technocracy instantiated, because technocracy, the technocratic paradigm, while it informed these various schools of socio-political utopian thinking, those various schools of socio-political utopianism were very selective in terms of what they lifted from technocratic theory for implementation in their own policies, and what they discarded, because according to early technocratic theoreticians such as St. Simon, a technocracy, a pure technocracy, is supposed to be apolitical. It's supposed to completely and totally remove special interest and lobbyists and what have you, and supplant them entirely with policy professionals. And
so the government would actually function on autopilot, sort of machine-driven.
Right, exactly. Well, that's exactly what they viewed the government as. They believed that government should just be an efficient, and that's an adjective that technocrats invoke ad nauseum, efficiency. They have this overwhelming preoccupation with efficiency, and
much like corporate America these days.
Yeah. There's a great deal of technocratic thought that runs throughout corporate America. Cultural feminism, which arguably is a form of Gnosticism towards a culture of androgyny, which is completely and totally ridiculous. I mean, there's no way that you're going to ever expunge the intrinsic differences between man and woman. But that's nonetheless what they seek to do, which of course is very scary when one considers the fact that androgyny is a hallmark of ant colonies and insect societies. And you look at several esoteric secret societies, such as the Bavarian Illuminati, which was a prominent secret society of the Enlightenment.
Adam Weishaupt.
Yeah, as Adam Weishaupt. And
the skeptics will tell you that was all disbanded, but we know from history that you can't kill an idea.
No, exactly. It was and that's largely what Weishaupt had contributed to, was the diffusion of an idea, or in the words of Dostoevsky, a fire in the minds of men. But if you look at one of the titles of the Bavarian Illuminati, the Order of the Bees. So you see this fascination with insects and with the insect model of society, which is of course
like one
the plague of the locust.
Yeah,
and the lice.
But a beehive doesn't seem to facilitate a hierarchy of power-hungry people that want to control. I mean, that's not...
Well, in a beehive, you have the queen, and then you simply have the drones.
So is that what these people envision, to be drones themselves?
Yeah, for all practical purposes.
Now, we actually saw the beginnings of a technocratic society in America right there around the FDR era.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah, you're right on target. You're right on target. In fact, the technocratic movement, which was a phenomenon at the time, many of its adherents believed that FDR should be basically be med the absolute dictator. And many technocrats believed that the New Deal would be, for all practical purposes, technocracy.
That's progressivism, what we call it here.
Progressivism actually was the precursor to the technocrats. It was one.
No, I thought, or it's the technocrat, the secret, and the progressivism is the show.
There was this little book written somewhere around 1932, and it was a short book. It was only like 75, 80 pages long, and it really laid out the whole idea of the technocratic society. It was kind of...
I believe the book you're thinking of is by Henry Porter, and in that book, Porter basically says... he says, "Will the New Deal be a technocracy?" And poses that question. Technocracy in its purest form, has never been, never witnessed instantiation. What you have though is several political theories that selectively lifted from technocratic theory and were instantiated. For instance, Marxism, which was disseminated on the popular level as communism. The Marxist concept of a planned economy, that for all practical purposes is lifted from the technocratic theory of centralized bureaucratic decision-making. You also, and again, Henri de Saint-Simon, who I was discussing earlier, his functional class analyses presaged Marx's own class analyses, and of course Henri de Saint-Simon was considered the earliest one of the earliest theoreticians of the technocratic of the technocratic paradigm, at least the earliest person to systematize and compile the ideas that constituted technocratic governance. And what you had with FDR is a good many of FDR's brain trust were admirers of Benito Mussolini and Benito Mussolini's corporatism.
So that stems back to Woodrow Wilson, who was actually the first technocrat, wasn't he?
Well, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive, and see, progressivism was a precursor of the technocratic movement here in the United States. One of the early progressives was none other than Edward Bellamy, who was also a Fabian socialist and a Freemason, and he wrote a book called Looking Backward. And this scientific novel basically presented a character who travels through time and finds himself, he awakens in a purely technocratic society where every facet of the individual's life is managed and directed. There is no more hunger, there is no more poverty, so you find all the elements of traditional socio-political utopianism in there. But of course, you will have this pervasive strain of anti-democratic thought. And his book, Looking Backward, was recommended reading for all technocrats, all members of the technocratic movement. And if you want to find the spiritual root of it, technocracy found its proximate origins. One of the very earliest promoters of a technocratic form of governance was Sir Francis Bacon, who, of course, was a student of Gnosticism. And so
was Nimrod, too? Didn't he do the same thing?
To a certain extent. Nimrod was definitely an autocrat and everything. It was, but Nimrod believed, adhered to an anthropocentric soteriology, believed that salvation emanated from within him. He was a rebel against God, and he rejected God as the source of his salvation. And there is where we have the spiritual root of it all, this anthropocentric soteriology, which later on became known as Gnosticism, and its inverted hermeneutic, where Jehovah becomes the evil archon of arrogance, and the serpent in Eden was an incognito savior attempting to liberate man, which, for all practical purposes, that's Luciferianism. That's the root of the spiritual root of all of this. What we see with evolutionary theory, what we see with materialism, scientism, radical empiricism, deism, are these attempts, theoretical attempts to ontologically divorce man entirely from God, which was what Gnosticism held, that the pneuma of man was separate from the divine pneuma, perpetually separate, and thereby excused from all moral compunction and had to seek his own salvation. Therein lies the real root of it all, and it can all be synopsized with one single adage, one single aphorism, which was uttered in the Garden of Eden so long ago, and that is, "Ye shall be as God." And if you look, you look at these at socio-political utopianism, which basically is just a collection of soteriological social movements. They've taken the notion of salvation, which all men need, all men require, and they have they have added something extraneous to it. They've superimposed their own private interpretations upon it, and it's no longer theocentric, it's anthropocentric.
Here we go, Kane.
Well, Phil, I think the point you make is absolutely profound. It just blew me away.
Truth be told, this was something that the Lord had been pointing out to me when I was sitting and reading the scriptures. Nothing that I discern in the scriptures is discerned of my own, cognitive powers. Truth be told, it's when I'm there and I'm prayerfully and honestly reading the scriptures that the Lord will point something out to me. And that was one of the things that I took note of. And what's interesting, some theologians have postulated that one of the reasons that Judas had betrayed Jesus was that Judas had some proclivities towards zealotry, which of course the zealots hoped to see the Messiah overthrow Rome. And so we have this completely politicized soteriology, this belief in a political salvation. And isn't that exactly what we see with, for instance, the evangelical Christian right today, the dominionist, the school of dominionism, which of course was closely aligned with neoconservatism and pervaded the administration of George W. Bush.
Could you unpack dominionism really quick so that we're all on the same page and our listeners know what we're talking about?
Sure. Okay, well, basically, dominionism in a nutshell, according to their eschatology, Jesus cannot or will not return to earth until until Christians co-opt all secular political and social institutions. And thus, Jesus' kingdom is reduced to a secular government established by and maintained through secular power. Now, while secular progressives cite dominionism as a violation of the separation of church and state, it actually represents the subsumption of the church under the state. Dominionism empowers temporal machinations. Social, political, and military powers attain ascendancy under the rubric of maintaining the dominionist government. And ultimately, the state is apotheosized. And again, this was an objective of earlier socio-political utopians. And that this particular strain, dominionism, that this particular strain of utopianism has a marginally theistic gloss. It acknowledges the existence of God. That's totally inconsequential. Dominionism still represents but one more permutation of socio-political utopianism, and this contention is reinforced by dominionism's inherently neo-Gnostic character. The neo-Gnostic character of dominionism is underscored by its mandate to build the kingdom of God in the here and now. The parousia, that is the second coming, they begin to see it as an event that is instigated by the hands of man, that there are certain prerequisites in terms of human activity that are required for the facilitation of the parousia. And that leads to all sorts of problems. That's a slippery slope to all sorts of troubles, because all of a sudden one is led to believe that, well, perhaps if we blow up the temple, perhaps if we rebuild the temple and such as the Temple Mount Faithful, we can prompt Jesus to return, and this leads to all sorts of violent radicalism, violent political activism. It's like pastors like John Hagee, who believes that a war between the Arab world and the Christian world is one of the necessary precursors to the parousia. He basically urges his congregation to support the presidency of George W. Bush, which was infested with neoconservatives, which ironically enough hail from the Enlightenment school, which was virulently anti-Christian. That, of course, has led to the quagmires that we have in Afghanistan and Iraq. And let me ask you a question: now that we have so many troops abroad and we've killed so many Iraqis, we've had Blackwater or Z mercenaries gunning down Iraqi civilians, and we've carpet bombed Afghan civilians. Does it appear as though Jesus is any closer to returning? Has he returned yet?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, the problem is because this belief that some human activity, some sort of that certain historical events are absolute precursors to the parousia. The problem is that all that does is that sets the stage, that provides a religious rationale for violent political activism that just begets a perpetual cycle of violence, which will never force the hand of God. That's not.
So if we follow that line of reasoning, you might say that the Christian dominionist is his own worst enemy.
Yes, he is, very much so. And what have we seen since the presidency of George W. Bush, which found a great deal of support from the dominionist community, from the evangelicals? We saw this backlash, and this was something that I had been predicting myself. I predicted it on several talk shows. We saw this backlash from the secular progressives, and now the new atheists, such as Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens. These people have all the intellectual ammunition they need to fire back at the Christian to make it appear as though Christianity is in fact a poison, a venom, a virus of the mind that once it infects those who adopt it, they become radical, violent, fanatical jihadists. And to a certain extent, the new atheist is not wrong, and that's the sad part. They're not wrong in that the dominionist is a jihadist. They are promoting jihad.
Playing both sides against the middle, sort of a Hegelian dialectic, including dominionism.
Well, you're absolutely right, because for all practical purposes, if you look at the culture war between secular progressives and evangelicals, That's a Hegelian dialectic, because for all practical purposes, you have two adherents of an anthropocentric soteriology. The dominionist, quite unconsciously an adherent of an anthropocentric soteriology, but an adherent nonetheless. That's the natural logical conclusion of dominionist theology, that man is facilitating his own salvation by instigating the parousia. Likewise, the secular progressive who may or may not believe in God, and if they do believe in God, God is reduced to an absentee landlord at best, subscribes to an anthropocentric soteriology, that man is the measure of all things, to paraphrase Protagoras. Many of them are secular humanist, and therefore man must basically facilitate his own salvation. And so these dialectical commonalities basically make it inconsequential that the conflict between the evangelicals and the secular progressives is superficial at best, and the outcome, who wins, is inconsequential. In fact, we might be seeing a Hegelian synthesis between the two, because we see men like Rick Warren, who is now closely aligned with secular progressives, men like Barack Obama.
And the emerging church movement, which Rick Warren is really a part of. We might even say he was the founder of the emerging church.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also with who was starting it was Norman Vincent Peale, and Robert Schuller. That sort of dominionist progressive thinking, and some even say Pat Robertson too. Would you agree?
With Schuller, the sad thing with Schuller is that I believe that the man he honestly believed that what he was espousing was genuine Christianity. But if you notice with Schuller, there was this preoccupation with politics, an overwhelming preoccupation with politics.
And D. James Kennedy, for that matter.
Right.
He became more and more of a political orator.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, he was also a participant in the Council for National Policy, or the CNP. Which,
oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, for all practical purposes, Mark Ambender has characterized him as a conservative answer to the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, which I mentioned earlier. Now, many members of the CNP deplore globalism. They're anti-globalist. However, what do they posit as a viable alternative to world government?
Yeah, they're both on the same trajectory.
Right. They posit an American empire as the only viable alternative. Well, for all practical purposes, that's just a unilateral form of world order. So all they oppose is a multilateral form of world order. But because because they accept a concept of global government under a different appellation, for some reason that makes it all the more legitimate to them. That somehow in their minds makes it diametrically opposed to what's being proposed by the globalists. In either case, though, you have nation states being undermined and subordinated to a supranational authority. That's the trap of dialectical logic, because people can't identify the dialectical commonalities of their own belief systems and can't identify the identical outcomes. They believe themselves to be truly dichotomously related to those they oppose, when in fact they're not diametrically opposed. In fact, they will eventually migrate towards a synthesis. And like you said, we might be witnessing such a synthesis with, for instance, the emergent church movement, what have you, Rick Warren, and everything. And that's the sad part. The culture war, I believe, for all practical purposes, has been lost because neither side is dichotomously related. Neither side is really proffering anything different. Both sides are equally anti-democratic, equally equally anthropocentric in their outlook, and so we really have just a feud, a superficial feud between ideological kissing cousins, whether or not they care to admit it, whether or not Oberman...
They're blind to the dialectic.
Yeah, whether or not Oberman
or Bill O'Reilly
or Bill O'Reilly want to admit it. The two of the talking heads of the punditocracy want to admit it. Their dialectical commonalities makes the conflict between the two entirely superficial.
Yeah.
I live for these aha moments in the Iron Show. I live for these aha moments where my eyes are open and I see something that I haven't seen before. And Phil, listening to you, I really see this Hegelian dialectic being played out. On one side, we have the Christian dominionists, and on the other side, we have the secular atheists. But what the funny thing is what I see is that they're both on the same exact trajectory. And that just amazes me. And isn't it strange, how an ex-punk rocker and an old longshoreman are seeing things that these sophisticated intellectuals are blind to? And would you say, Phil, it's simply because the three of us are not dipping Jesus in the sauce?
I'd certainly like to think so and everything. Again, it's really... anything that I discern, it's only because the Lord's shown me it and everything, and it's taken me
totally.
It's only because sometimes I feel sorry for the Lord because I realize that He's dealing with a very stubborn pupil with me. I mean, I'm not an easy person to teach. I'm not a very lovable person, but I'm thankful that he has patiently worked with me over these years and has opened my eyes to several truths and has shown me truths in the scriptures and everything. As it is, I'm sure that you can relate and everything. The Lord, revelation is sometimes is this gradual. This gradual process of disambiguation, and it takes a while and everything, but eventually, the Lord opens your eyes to certain truths and everything, and I'm finding more and more, the more and more I study this, the more and more I'm driven back to my Bible, not because I'm attempting to superimpose biblical eschatology and Bible prophecy upon the events of today, because while I believe that there is prophetic significance to the events of today, I don't want to fall into the premillennialist trap of qualifying certain historical events as necessary precursors to Jesus' second coming.
And speaking of that, this whole time listening to you and listening to your podcasts and you on other shows regarding the technocracy, the technocratic society, I see all over this the number of the beast system. Do you agree, or am I way off base there?
I mean, whether or not the technocratic proclivities of the current societal configurations that we currently have witnessed emerging throughout in this current period of human history, whether or not that ultimately leads to the system of the beast, one thing we can rest assured of, the intended outcome would be such a system, because it all stems from, again, the belief that man is the measure of all things, that ye shall be as gods, and that's ultimately those are the ideas that the system of the beast is premised upon. Now, bear in mind. Now, we don't know if that's going to take place anytime soon. It might.
Yeah, it might not. I understand that. I could say that, but I think it's only fair to let me speculate a little.
Sure.
No, nothing wrung with that, Johnny. You know that.
It's all. Of course, it's all in the hands of the Lord. It's all going to unfold according to His prophetic schematic and everything. The point is, and this is why the research continues to drive me back to the Scripture, is that what we witness with these various plans to establish a world utopia, to create heaven on earth, to emanetize the eschaton, in the words of Eric Vogelin. All of those are basically outward expressions of the same ideas we see expressed by the adversary in the Scripture. Ye shall be as gods, and that's why I go back to the Scriptures more and more to identify these ideas, these principles that underpin all these various socio-political utopian crusades throughout history.
It all seems to be an extension of the original sin, the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, whereby gnosis was gained and the original rebellion began.
Yes, exactly. And with the eating of the knowledge of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, we see that veneration of knowledge, according to socio-political utopianism, which is just basically an outgrowth of Gnosticism. We are supposed to reason apart from him. And thus what happens to reason? Reason is apotheosized. Reason becomes God. The intellect of man is deified. That's the slippery slope towards which we find ourselves sliding if we attempt to reason apart from God. But at the end of the day, they see that even that is meaningless, and that's fraught with all sorts of internal contradictions. And so, you have people who are just profoundly unhappy, profoundly miserable. John D. Rockefeller, he was asked, how much can you acquire before you're happy? How you have so much money, you have so much wealth, when will you be satisfied? And he says, he told the person who asked him the question, he says, I just need a little more, just a little bit more. But a little more never proved to be enough. And that's what, at the end of the day, these people are empty. These people are empty. And they don't know, who we know. We know Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ, not to give an altar call, but Jesus Christ will fill you up. He will give you meaning. He will give you purpose. He will give you value. You derive your value from him, and you derive your meaning from him. And at the end of the day, we know that these people, being the embodiment of that Antichrist spirit that John talked about in his first epistle, they don't know him. And so that's why it's all a house of cards. It's all falling down. It's toppling, around their ears, even as they're attempting to erect it. And that's why even if they ever tangibly enact their vision for society, the instant they do, the fuse on the bomb is lit, and it will come apart all around them, because none of it will last in the face of the Lord. I mean, we're talking about the God who brought Egypt to its knees.
The God who spoke the universe into existence.
Yes, spoke the universe into existence, and you know what? He can speak it out if he wanted to.
That's right.
So these guys, it's all for all practical purposes, it's all a vapor, and it's all fading, and that's why I take great comfort when I read the Scriptures, and that's one of the reasons this research draws me back to the Lord and to His Word, because it reminds me that as insurmountable as it appears, it's really all nothing. It's all vapor.
Yeah, and I'd like to address the people. I'd like to talk to the people that are listening to this right now. If you're one of those people, one of those Gnostics, one of those pagans, one of those technocrats, you really do not have an answer for death. You really do not have an answer for what happens when I die. And Jesus is the only answer. And Phil, we got no problem with you giving an altar call. I mean, you're on the Iron Show, right, Rick?
No, he basically did. Phil is exactly right. Jesus is the whole, it is all about him anyway. And he is the author and finisher of our faith. He is the only one. In him alone is there satisfaction. I like the saying that Jonathan Edwards says and John Piper says. It's one of my favorite things that I say to myself daily just to remind myself is God is most glorified when you are most satisfied in Him. That's what it is the secondary things that a Christian is waiting for of heaven and the place that we're headed to. If we don't have satisfaction in God first alone, our Creator, the other things are, what are the other things really matter? Those are just the blessings that God gives us. And for the person that's caught into that, to understand that you're gonna of all that you understand of, social political utopianism and technocracy, as right? Am I saying these right, Philip?
Yeah, you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just like, man, this is like a lot of new territory that I'm exploring now. Now I'm going to be exploring this. I'm going to have to, get your book and put it in one of my collections so I can kind of understand it even more. Because I'm really, like I said, I'm on the right path. But for that person that's out there, you're there. You're right in the middle of it, and you're going to come to that conclusion. And either you're going to come to that conclusion when it's too late, or you're going to come to that conclusion. You can come to that conclusion right now, because here it is, right out. It's laid out in front of you. You can eat at the table. The feast is there. God has said, "Come, here you go. Come, take and eat. Taste and see that the Lord is good, and He's the best thing that you ever bite into. He is the manna from heaven. He is the bread of life,
and He is the only answer to death."
Yeah, well, He's been there,
Yeah,
He's been there. Yeah.
Us.
You mention death to God, and He can say, "Hey, been there, done that." And now that I've done that, you've nothing to fear and anything, because to live is Christ, to die is the gain.
And that's a good place to end the conversation. Phil, I've been listening to you for a long time. I'm a big fan of yours, and it's just great to talk to you. I tell you, I love listening to you, but it's a lot better to be able to talk to you, and it's just been great.